So we focus quite a bit on sprint planning and estimating, and that's because estimating in particular and the sprint planning meeting in general is probably one of the most tricky to get right. So now we're going to look at some of the other Scrum meetings in a little bit more detail. I would say broadly the most important thing with these meetings is keeping the discipline and consistency within them. It's something that certainly takes practice, but they are, relatively speaking, straightforward. So we will start with the sprint review, and the reason I'm starting with this one is because I think once you've got past the sprint planning meeting, in terms of challenge level, the sprint review is probably the next most challenging to do well and get right. So this is the product owners meeting. So essentially the goal of the meeting is for the team to demonstrate the product to the product owner and show that they have accomplished the sprint goal essentially during the sprint. So where we should be in a sprint review meeting is that you have a finished product that you are demonstrating and that you would be happy to show to an external customer. Very often this meeting ends up in a situation where the team are literally taking a status with the product owner, demonstrating the product with a list of caveats of things that are not tested, not finished, need to be resolved in the next sprint. You should be at a point where you are ready to release that product out to your customer base. That should be the whole point really of the sprint review. And the product owner should be in a position really representing the customer and the other stakeholders to make an appropriate assessment of that. The other thing that is quite important in this meeting is to review the burndown and velocity charts and discuss whether an item has really met the acceptance criteria that the product owner has outlined. Now, the burndown and velocity charts are essentially just reports which help you track your success or failure and ability as a team to deliver backlog items and achieve that sprint goal. So these are very useful reports, and on the next slide we'll take a look at a couple of examples. So burndown and velocity charts essentially allow you to track your progress through the sprint. Have you managed to estimate accurately and achieve delivery of all of the items that you actually committed to at the beginning in that sprint planning meeting? So if we look at the product burndown chart example, what we should see is that the blue line of estimated burndown matches up roughly with the real burndown. That means that your estimates are matching up with your forecast and your ability to deliver. What most teams end up doing is that they have some initial success and then they flatline for a fair while before they actually start to see that real burn down start to drop. That's a fairly typical behavior and result, especially when teams are immature and are learning this delivery method. If we now take a look at the velocity chart, we'll see from sprints 1, 2 and 3 that the level of items completed isn't quite matching up with the level of items committed to. And again, this is fairly typical kind of trajectory. So by the time we get to sprint 4, the team has learnt to more accurately estimate and is delivering the number of committed items as they are actually creating those estimates and forecasts for. So that I would say would be a fairly normal approach. At the end of the day, anything that you can't measure, you cannot scrutinize and thereby improve on. Most agile management solutions of any kind will have something like a burn down and a velocity chart in them. This is a very, very common data reporting approach for this methodology. So whether they're called something different, they should look fairly similar. And I thoroughly recommend that you make use of them. So a meeting that is often skipped is actually the backlog review or backlog refinement meeting. So this is the meeting really where the product owner reviews the backlog and updates and prioritizes the backlog items. So an agile product backlog in Scrum, just as a reminder, is a prioritized features list which essentially contains short descriptions of all functionality desired in the product. Really, this meeting is an opportunity for the product owner to discuss with the team, for the team to ask for any additional information and possibly scrutinise a bit what items the product owner wants the team to prioritise within the next sprint. So it gives an opportunity for that feedback loop to happen. It also gives an opportunity for the team to roughly size certain items. So if the product owner needs to make some hard choices in terms of priority calls for the next sprint, they have the opportunity to actually do that. And that's so that they are ready to go as a group in the sprint planning come the next week. Failure to take this meeting often leads to overruns in the sprint planning meeting. I would thoroughly suggest that you definitely take this meeting. When you run it properly and you are disciplined about it, it's actually invaluable. So a meeting which really needs to happen every day, with the exception of the days where you might have the sprint review and the sprint planning meeting, is the daily scrum. And there are 3 key things you really need to discuss within the daily scrum. And you need to state essentially what you accomplished yesterday, what you are going to work on today, and is there anything that will prevent you from achieving this task today. This is always in a stand-up format. It's never more than 15 minutes long, and really it's just to have an open communication to ensure that by the end of the week you will be able to achieve that sprint goal. So if there is anything objectively which that you have an opportunity to communicate that with your team members and your Scrum Master and your product owner and essentially resolve that in order that you achieve your sprint goal at the end of the sprint. In a live situation where you have people physically in an office space, often the daily scrum can turn into a scrum zombies situation where people come into the room, they stand around the room, they look at the shared backlog or task board, and they literally repeat the same thing every day. One easy way to resolve this is to literally switch off the electronic board, stop people from getting into that brain switched off, I'm watching the TV kind of mindset, and actually physically engage with each other just like you would if you were going to meet a friend for a coffee. You would be looking at their face, you would be thinking about what they're saying, and that's the level of alertness you should have in every daily scrum. So the level of energy in every meeting really should be more like this. Make sure you avoid the zombie pose. That's quite a common pitfall. And I guess the final meeting, which is another one which is often skipped, and I thoroughly recommend that you don't skip it and that you actually run the sprint retrospective. So the sprint retrospective is quite key, and that's because if you are generating reports from your sprint review which suggests that you're not estimating appropriately, you actually have a chance to discuss what went well, what went badly, and how can we improve for the next sprint. Look through that data, decide what issues that you've been having as a team, and actually commit some tasks between the team in order to make some improvements. Anything that you can't measure, you can't improve on. Anything that you can't have an open discussion about and commit to improving, obviously you're not going to get that traction, you're not going to see that improvement over time. So it's actually quite a critical meeting to take, and one that I can recommend that you don't actually skip. That really is a reasonable rundown of the different meetings in Scrum and why they're important and what you need to do within those meetings. Next, we're going to consolidate your knowledge by having a little 10-minute exercise and activity. But before we do that, I'm going to let you grab a coffee and take a break, and I'll see you in the next lesson.